Welcome, everyone. Thank you for listening to the Council of Institutional Investors, Voice of Corporate Governance, the number one best corporate governance podcast as determined by Million Podcasts. I'm your host, Jeff Mahoney, General Counsel of CII. Our topic for this episode of the Voice of Corporate Governance is the shadow SEC's views on SEC Chair Paul Atkins' plans to scrap quarterly financial statement reporting. And my special guest is a member of the shadow SEC, James D. Cox, the Brainerd Curie Distinguished Professor of Law at Duke University. Welcome back, Professor Cox. Honored to have you on the program.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Professor, on December 16th, 2024, you were one of a group of law professors that announced the formation of the Shadow SEC. So what is the Shadow SEC? Who are its members, and why was it formed?
Well, it's pretty much a self-appointed group. The initial movers were Joel Seligman. I'll come back and say who that person is, and John goes by Jack Coffey. Those are law professors. Joel is undoubtedly the dean, I would call, of securities regulation professors. He stepped onto the treatise as a pretty young fellow with Louis Loss at Harvard, the very first and dominant treatise of securities regulation law, and has been the cornerstone of that ever since. And it remains this huge multi-volume series of the go-to source for when you have a securities regulatory question. And Jack is one of the foremost corporate governance and securities commentators in America. The other three members are John Coates. He left the general counsel's position at the SEC with the election a year ago, and was before that acting director of Division of Corporate Finance, which does most of the regulatory issues for the SEC. He's a chaired professor at Harvard, was a partner at Wachtell Lipton before that. Also on the body are Merritt Fox, also Columbia Law professor, and then myself. So those are the five people: Seligman, Coffey, Coates, Fox, and myself. And what we decided to do, we thought not so much to be ad hominem, not really questioning the judgments, but we thought that given the fact that we're all pretty superannuated, that we had the vision of history, and we would try whenever we possibly could to say, wait a minute, before you do this, there's something that happened in our lifetimes that are very analogous to what you're trying to do here, and they shine a light on what's likely to be the result. And one of the topics we're looking at today is quarterly reporting, and we've been there, done that, okay? And not only have we been there and done that, but we're also I'll mention in my comments that the EU and the UK recently did this, and we can profit from their experiences. So the idea would be not to get into things sort of polemics, which seems to me just shuts down conversation, but to have the eye of history introduced into the equation and say, look, what can we learn from this? And what might you learn from this to think about it? Okay? So that's why we did it.
Well, Professor, let's talk about some of that history. So in the Shadow SEC's recently issued statement number 7, you raised concerns about SEC Chair Paul Atkins' reported plans to fast-track President Donald Trump's push to eliminate quarterly reporting requirements for U.S. public companies. So can we begin by providing our listeners with some history on the U.S. quarterly reporting requirements in the United States?
Yes, we can. And some of that history actually happened on Trump's first watch as president of the United States. The chairman of the SEC, under pressure from the White House, circulated a request for comments in 2017 about whether it would be appropriate to step away from having mandatory quarterly reporting for filing companies, for reporting companies in the SEC. And what was interesting was overwhelmingly, not just the majority, but overwhelmingly, the support for commentators, both by issuers and also by users, came in and had strong support for maintaining quarterly reporting. To be sure, they said, look, quarterly reporting needs to be retained. But we think there's areas where it needs tweaking so as to reduce the burdens of the process and or make that process more meaningful. And the SEC responded. So it wasn't all that long ago that we ran this flag up the pole, and we found nobody really wanted to salute it, but they wanted to try and make it fly a little bit wider, a little bit broader, in a more useful way. So we did that. In our comments in our statement about quarterly reporting, we again said, look, there's another situation that's happened here, and that is the United Kingdom and the EU both made quarterly reporting voluntary. So they have essentially semi-annual reports, an annual report, and anything in between there, quarterly reports, would be voluntary. The experience in both the UK and the EU is that over 90% of the companies continued to issue quarterly reports. And they did that for good reason. And so I can explain some of those reasons as I see that I can anticipate other questions, and I'll do that. If I don't, I'll come back to them. But the idea is that both the regulated community, which are issuers, okay, and the consumers of that information are not just supportive, but so strongly supportive of the maintenance of the existing systems.
Professor, one of the arguments that's frequently made by those advocating for the elimination of quarterly reporting is that quarterly reporting leads to short-termism. So what does short-termism mean, and what does the shadow SEC think of that argument?
Well, the simple expression for short-termism covers something about consuming your own seed corn for present benefits and therefore jeopardizing the future. And the classic illustration of that in financial reporting is that you cut back on research and development, cut back on expenditures to nurture new relationships with customers. And you do that to save cash and not recognize expenses for present benefits. And in the end, you're cutting off your nose to spite your face. That's the idea about this. There's several things that's really wrong with the suggestion. No, there's no evidence. So we go back to the European experience, and studies have been done of this, a great empirical base. And you look at companies that said, oh, so we don't have to issue quarterly reports. And then you have firms that issue quarterly reports. They were the choice. So you just put those in two different bundles and you do an analysis of how they perform. And what are you looking at? What do they do about expenditure for R&D? And you find that for most companies, there's no change at all, that otherwise the presence or absence of having to make quarterly reports had no impact upon management's discretionary behavior about what the level of R&D was going to be. In fact, it was just the other way around, that the firms that were abiding by quarterly reports, not abiding by them, but agreeing to do that, were the ones that are investing in the future. The other thing is, this whole argument about short-termism and the incentives for short-termism. Short-termism is a bad idea. But you want to know something? Jeff, you and your members are not dumb. You're not stupid. Okay? You understand that if a firm's going to be managing itself, it needs to be looking forward in time, not just backward in time. And we know that the first line of defense for short-termism, the first line of defense for making sure your managers are perfectly aligned with shareholder interests, and that is the structure of the compensation package. So the first line of defense in any good thinking firm is the compensation package that you're going to provide to your management team to make sure that they make discretionary decisions and their stewardship is reflecting the best interests of the company. The other thing that totally ignores is there's huge pressure for information from the investment community. And management's more than happy to succumb to that pressure, because if they don't, they get penalized in the marketplace. And so those, the studies, and I've actually done some of these studies myself, study indicates that the firms that are forthcoming about making financial forecasts, even if it's bad news, that they garner a benefit for their shares in the marketplace. So by merely getting rid of this regulatory event called requirement to file a 10Q, doesn't make all these other incentives and pressures go away. And so they're going to happen anyway. And management likes to, one, they either like it or they succumb to the pressure to provide earnings guidance. And they like to be able to meet that earnings guidance. So that's part of the dynamics. The other thing that's going on here is they also complain about the cost. Studies of the cost, a recent study of that was, when was it? 2019, just 6 years ago. The Certified Financial and Analyst Association did a study and they found that these costs for quarterly reports have been going down. Well, the other thing about the cost we have to understand is that the costs are really in the formatting of the information, the presentation of the information. It's not the generation of the information. You want your managers to have quarterly reports. You'd like to have them being tuned in to make on a daily basis to know just exactly what the temperature is of the patient. And the patient is the one over which you had stewardship with. So we're not asking companies to generate new information. What's being required of them in quarterly reports, just like semi-annual reports and the annual report, is to share the information that's already in the organization itself and being relied upon by management. So that's a key factor.
Professor, another proposed justification for eliminating quarterly reporting is that quarterly reporting may inhibit the number of initial public offerings. What's the Shadow SEC's view on that argument?
I think that's not a good argument. And I think it's for the same reason that quarterly reporting, when you step into the public reporting system, which you're required to do if you make going to have an IPO, then you step into the requirements to file quarterly and annual reports under Section 15D of the Exchange Act. And you find that companies want to be able to do this for a couple of reasons, okay? One reason is that this just is certifying that you're going to continue to update investors. Investors want to have this information because and these are investors not in the IPO itself, but in the secondary market. That is, that this periodic disclosure facilitates not only a secondary market, but a deep secondary market. And that's something, if you're going to buy an IPO, you want to make sure you have liquidity. And one of the things that goes hand in hand with liquidity is the availability of trustworthy information about the registrant, the issuer here. Okay. That is one very important factor in this whole process. The other thing that goes in here is that a company that engages in IPO does it in part to provide liquidity for its existing investors by creating a robust secondary market for their shares. But they also are growing, and they're going to have to go back to the markets again. And what the SEC has allowed for several years now is that companies that have stepped into the public reporting system and therefore are filing quarterly reports and annual reports, once they file an annual report, they can then catch a market window. That is, we have expanded the universe of firms that can then catch market windows when there's excessive amounts of investor interest in equities and optimistic a moment in capital markets, that you can decide and go to that market very quickly in what we call a shelf registration. That heretofore, shelf registrations required companies, at one time, you had to be in the public reporting system for 3 years. Now it's reduced substantially to 1 year. But now the requirement is that you can use the shelf registration system and catch a market window. And you can catch that market window, okay, anytime you can take advantage of it if you filed an annual report. So this is tremendously advantage, not just for the issuer to raise more capital, but you have these other people on the sidelines who could not sell their shares in the IPO because they were subject to a lockup device. And so now you can catch a market window, file the registration materials, catch that window, and get their liquidity. So it greatly facilitates the liquidity of the holders, and liquidity goes hand in hand with the ability to sell the securities in the initial offering that was made to the public to begin with. So they all comes back together. Can I just add another thing here, Jeff?
Sure.
It wasn't in the questions we talked about previously. There is an awful lot of risk reduction disclosures in the securities laws that facilitates secondary markets, that facilitates the depth of securities markets that are keyed and tied to 10Qs. That is that I already talked about one of them, and that is shelf registrations. It's very interesting to me. I went back and looked at the legislative history. So we've had quarterly reports since early 1970s. I think it was October 21st of 1970 that we finally adopted quarterly reporting. That's a long time ago. I mean, that's 55 years ago. That's actually when I began my teaching career. And it went back. And one of the reasons they adopted quarterly reporting was to facilitate shelf registrations and easy access to market. And they saw that the linchpin for being able to enable issuers to catch these market windows, periods of euphoria and when to go out, now's a good time to sell debt, was the quarterly report. You're going to sacrifice a lot of certainty by getting rid of quarterly. It's not going to go away. That's a very, very important factor, liquidity. And that's for your shareholders. And what's bothersome about your very first question about, well, why, what's happening here and why we've been down this road before. These are the views that are put forth by individuals that are not on the buy side. And I'm not sure they're really views that are put forth on the sell side. Individuals on the sell side understand that you've got to have that certainty. And that's terrifically important. And, we're not talking about generating information. That information is already in the pipeline on the CFO's desk, on the CEO's desk. And, one of the things that's tied into quarterly reports is every quarter we have after Sarbanes-Oxley, after the great bubble burst of the dot-com era, is the need for the chief financial officer and the chief operating officer to sit down, look at those financial statements, and sign on a piece of paper that they've looked at them. And to their best of their knowledge, they comply with GAAP. And to the best of their knowledge, there's no weaknesses in internal controls. And we're aware of a couple of frauds that are massive frauds that are in the marketplace right now, and that wasn't happening. So it's truly prophylactic to have these quarterly reports, because what it does, it makes people sit down. We forget that a number of large publicly held companies that the CEO had not looked at the quarterly reports or the annual reports when they're released to the shareholders. They're just delegated. So we're a long ways from the dot-com era, thank God. Let's don't go back to it.
Professor, assuming the Chair Atkins SEC ignores the advice of the shadow SEC and moves forward to issue a proposed rule to end quarterly reporting, what would the shadow SEC's fallback proposal look like? And how would an institutional investor evaluate the quality of the SEC's economic analysis that would be required to accompany any proposed rulemaking related to quarterly reporting?
Let me take the first part of that there. There's a range of issues that are now being discussed in probably the hallways. Since nobody's in the building doing any work, I presume it's in the hallways around the water cooler. And all of them have the same thing. It's the idea that the mantra of American business today is private ordering. And so the idea would be that the fallback position would be, say, there's not a requirement, and I can't speak for my other four members of the shadow SEC, I'm speaking for myself, but the template could be something like this. You say, well, companies don't have to have quarterly reports, but they could be required by their shareholders to have quarterly reports. So you let corporations either opt into them or opt out of it, and that would be exposed to the shareholder bodies. I would imagine management would not treasure that, because the shareholders are, like I said, they're not dopes. They get the benefits of this. Shareholders historically have liked more and trustworthy information, and this is that's what I think would be possible. I think it's going to be very difficult in our political environment to just totally SEC unilaterally say, well, we're not going to do this. I mean, I think there's implications all the way through the 33 and 34 Act that says that this is not a fair game for their exemptive authority under the 34 and the 33 Act. So I don't see that. So, that is at one level. And at the same time, the cost of this would be, I think, enormous to the issuers. I think that, well, and the key factor would be if you get rid of the requirement for filing 10-Qs, you're still going to find companies voluntarily disclose it because it's in their interest to do so, quarterly information. So there, I would take a page out of the now challenge to climate disclosures and say, look, the really key factor for investors in the disclosure regulation is comparability. We want to make sure that just as we have a requirement, again, coming out of SOX, that if you start saying EBITDA, it's not your EBITDA, it's not her EBITDA, okay? It's not his EBITDA. It's a generally well understood term of what EBITDA means, okay? And if you're going to be doing that, then use something of accounting significance. We all got to be talking the same language. Well, the same thing, if you're going to be talking about voluntary information in their quarterly reports, we want to make sure that's comparable. One of the great benefits of SEC reporting is we made this stuff all machine readable. It's all searchable. It enhances comparability. And so we don't want to go to a regime which is we're going backwards in time and saying, well, gee, we know computers can always do these comparisons, but we're going to let people put things in a way that really makes them not comparable. Okay. So the special language in which financial information is filed needs to be readable and must be in a format that's similar to the same kind of information. It must be using the same terms. And if that's happening, then it seems to me you're right back in the loop of saying, well, we can't have comparability unless pretty much everybody's doing the same thing. Now, those who choose not to make quarterly reports will just get punished. Economic theory, there's been a couple of Nobel Prizes awarded for developing the theory around signaling, okay? And it's all going to point to the fact that if you're the low person on the totem pole, not making the mandated form of reporting, you're going to be penalized in the marketplace because there's just greater risk associated with why you're doing that. Why are you choosing not to do it and everybody else is? I can see a world in which we say, well, we're just going to let everything be sort of a matter of free choice, but that ignores comparability, and we want to have comparability whenever we have a lot of firms talking about the same thing. We want to make sure they're talking about the same thing. It's in a format that's machine readable, and the cheapest route for that is everybody plays by the same games and abides by the same rule.
Professor, final question. Not only are you a leading expert on corporate securities law issues, but you are also a leading expert on Duke basketball. As of the date of this recording, your Blue Devils' current ranking is number 6 in the Associated Press Top 25 poll for the 2025-2026 season. And my Michigan Wolverines' current ranking in the same poll is 7. The Blue Devils and Wolverines will meet on February 21st, 2026 at Capital One Arena here in Washington, D.C. This neutral site game is part of an event called the Duel in the District. And as you know, these teams first met back in December 21st, 1963, when the Cazzie Russell-led Wolverines were known for its bloody nose alley defense, while the Jeff Mullins-led Blue Devils were regarded as a team that played in tuxedos. Michigan hosted that game at the historic Yost Fieldhouse, winning 83-67. But in the 29 games played since then, the Blue Devils have won 22, with perhaps their biggest win at the 1992 NCAA Final Four, when the Christian Laettner, Grant Hill, Bobby Hurley-led Blue Devils won by a 71-53 margin against the Fab Five-led Wolverines. And thereafter, the Blue Devils repeated as national champions. So my question, Professor, is for your prediction for the upcoming game in February. Who's going to win and by how many points?
Well, I'll briefly to give you a quick rundown. My tongue is guided by my annuity, which is in a cabinet over there. And my annuity is a hat I was given by the team, the 1991 team, our first national championship. And it's signed by all the players of that team. You mentioned many of them. And I figure that even the market goes to hell and my 404k just disappears, I can sell that hat and buy some food for that month. Okay. So I don't speak independently. But, just looking at this team and what's going on in basketball, Jeff, you and I both know the game has changed. And what really happens is these are very talented players. They're, much more talented than the old Cazzie Russell team but that said, boy, on that night, the mature team that shows up that night wins. That's the key thing. And that may be my explanation for what happened to us last year against Houston. But that being the case, whoever is the more mature and can hold their emotions together, that's who's going to win. But they're both talented teams. There's no doubt about it.
That concludes our podcast episode. On behalf of the Council of Institutional Investors, I want to again thank my special guest, James D. Cox, the Brainerd Curie Distinguished Professor of Law at Duke University and a member of the Shadow SEC. If you have any questions or comments regarding this podcast, please feel free to contact me at Jeff, that's JEFF @CII.org. Until next time, I'm Jeff Mahoney Thanks again for listening to the Voice of Corporate Governance.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Voice of Corporate Governance, brought to you by the Council of Institutional Investors. The Voice of Corporate Governance is a free, non-sponsored podcast that highlights critical developments in corporate governance and other important issues affecting institutional investors. The views expressed by those interviewed on the podcast do not necessarily reflect the views of CII or its members. For more information on CII and its policies on corporate governance, please visit our website at www.cii.org.